to start our afternoon session, not with a prayer this time. In one of my very first trips onto the road, almost 20 years ago now, I started the afternoon session with a 5-minute period of silent prayer that I led people into by inviting them to close their eyes. So I'm going to begin this afternoon with a brief reading from the American essayist and humorist James Thurber. I don't have a date for this, but I would guess it's from the 1930s. And you could call this piece The Parable of the Cows. Now, Thurber doesn't call it that, but you can call it that. So listen to this piece from James Thurber. A friend of mine has an electric fence around a piece of his land, and he keeps 2 cows there. I asked him one day how he liked his fence and whether it cost much to operate. It doesn't cost a damn thing, he replied. As soon as the battery ran down, I unhooked it and never put it back. That strand of fence wire is as dead as a piece of string, but the cows don't go within 10 feet of it. They learned their lesson the first few days. Herbert continues. Apparently, this state of affairs is general throughout the United States. Thousands of cows are living in fear of a strand of wire that no longer has the power to confine them. Freedom is theirs for the asking. Rise up, cows. Take your liberty while despots snore. And rise up to all people in bondage everywhere. The wire is dead. The trick is exhausted. Come on out. And that will preach. So I move into the third and final talk of the day on being Christian in the 21st century. And again, the title begins with the word beyond. This talk beyond cultural convention to alternative values and community. And using the language on the handout, the premise of this talk is that ever since Christianity became the dominant religion of the Roman Empire in the 4th century, conventional Christianity, meaning the majority form of Christianity, conventional Christianity has commonly reinforced the values of the culture in which it lives. And then, as on your handout, multiple brief examples of that. When culture accepted slavery, most Christians accepted slavery. And it's very helpful to remember that this lasted in this country until about 150 years ago, when the churches of this country were split deeply about whether or not the Bible taught slavery. By the way, those who argued that the Bible taught slavery were right. And many of my conservative college students are amazed to find that there are passages in the Bible that legitimate slavery because they've been taught that the Bible is inerrant or infallible, but that part of the Bible is never pointed out. No. When culture was racially segregated, and by culture I basically mean society here, when culture was racially segregated, most Christians accepted segregation. When culture was patriarchal, most Christians accepted patriarchy. When culture saw heterosexuality as normative, most Christians accepted heterosexuality as normative. And by heterosexuality as normative, you could call it heterosexism. The notion that heterosexual behavior is the normative pattern of human sexual behavior. And when culture endorsed and endorses war, most Christians living within that society endorse war. So there's been a kind of one last bit in the intro. If we ask what are the dominant values of contemporary American society, in terms of what makes our society tick, not the list of values that people might come up with because they sound good. As I was thinking about this a number of years ago, I came up with what I call the 3 A's of contemporary American values. Affluence, doing well, achievement, standing out, appearance, looking good. These dominate our advertising to a large extent, dominate our television programs and so forth. And of course, these 3 values are radically different from what we find in the biblical tradition. By the way, it's interesting to note that a good portion of prosperity-centered contemporary Christianity also embraces these 3 values. Looking good, doing well, to some extent standing out, and all of this in the name of Jesus. So I turn to the heart of what I want to say in this afternoon's talk, namely, how do we go about educating about the alternative values and vision and community that we find in the Bible, educating about what I will be calling God's passion for justice and peace. How do we bring this into local congregations? And let me grant that this is the most political part of what I'll be doing today. And therefore, it's an especially sensitive topic for a good number of Christians, and perhaps in many congregations. So how do we go about educating about this? I begin with a prologue. If you're going to do this, it's important to emphasize that the Bible is both personal and political, or both religious and spiritual and political, if you will. It is about a personal relationship to God and the need to be born again and again. And if you don't emphasize this, as you also teach about the political passion of the Bible, people will think you're just turning the Bible into politics. But then the second point, it is also about politics, about God's passion for justice and peace. The Bible is a pervasively political collection of documents from beginning to end, from Israel's beginnings in the Exodus through the book of Revelation, and I'll say a bit more about this soon. In Jim Wallace's words from his important book, God's Politics, published just after the 2004 presidential election, Wallace comments, "The God of the Bible is personal, but never private," which is a way of saying, and also political. A clarifying remark about the word justice. God's passion for justice is not about punitive justice or retributive justice. Now, I emphasize this because the most common meaning of the word justice in contemporary American society is criminal justice. You know, the Department of Justice in the federal government is headed by the person who's named as our chief law enforcement official, the Attorney General. And of course, the Department of Justice is charged with the enforcement of criminal and civil law. So some people, when they hear that the God of the Bible is passionate about justice, will simply think, well, yeah, God wants those criminals to get what's coming to them. And if you understand it that way, you miss the point completely. Justice in the Bible is mostly about distributive or economic justice, namely about the just distribution of God's earth. And this passion is grounded in a very familiar claim in the Bible. To whom does the earth belong? Well, as the psalmist puts it, the earth is the Lord's, and all that is in it. Again, contrast this to how we typically look at things. We typically think of the earth as belonging to us. and to some of us more than to others of us, and also belonging to us as a species, that the other species that inhabit this earth are kind of there for our use and disposal, and too bad if they get in the way of something we want to do. But the Bible's affirmation is, the earth is the Lord's and the fullness thereof. And given this, the God of the Bible is passionate that everybody have enough, not through charity, but as the product of justice. And then if we ask, why is the God of the Bible passionate about politics? The answer is very simple. Because the greatest sources of unnecessary human misery are political, namely economic injustice and political violence, or if you will, war, because that's basically what war is about, political violence. And it's important, still kind of as part of the prologue, to realize that the opposite of God's justice in the Bible is not primarily God's mercy. Footnote here. It's unfortunate that this contrast has been part of our language. The notion that if God were just in relationship to us, God would send all of us to hell. So we're just plain lucky that God is merciful instead of just. Well, to see mercy as the opposite of God's passion for justice is not true to the Bible at all. In the Bible, the opposite of God's justice is not mercy. The opposite of God's justice is human injustice. And so when the prophets are passionate about the justice of God, what they're speaking against is the human injustice of humanly created systems. That is the problem. So again, the question becomes, how do we educate about this? But very important, if we want to help people to see this in the Bible, we might begin, I would say perhaps we should begin, with the world of the Bible, the kind of world in which the figures of ancient Israel in the New Testament lived and which they addressed. And in shorthand, the world of the Bible is what an increasing number of scholars call a form of the ancient domination system. So let me now explain what the ancient domination system by beginning with how domination systems emerged in human history. And I'm going to give you a historical sweep of the totality of human history here in under 10 minutes. So listen up. If you miss a sentence, you might miss a million years or so. Okay? And in a way, all of this is so obvious, but when you start thinking it through, it becomes very interesting. Okay? Language from the handout. The earliest human societies were quite economically egalitarian. Let me explain that. The earliest human societies, and we don't know how early we should be thinking, earliest human remains that have been uncovered seem to be about 5 million years old. But the earliest form of human living together in groups was hunting and gathering societies. Agriculture had not been discovered yet. Large animals had not yet been domesticated. Indeed, even the dog was domesticated apparently only about 15,000 years ago. So you didn't have horses or donkeys or any of that yet. Instead, you had people living in nomadic groups, hunting and gathering society. Now, in a society like this, what did wealth mean? Wealth basically meant whatever you could carry on your back. You know, you didn't have permanent dwellings. I've already mentioned you didn't have large animals that could carry your gear for you. Wealth was basically what you could carry on your back. So there was no gap between rich and poor. And moreover, these hunting and gathering societies were basically communal in nature. If you happened as a hunter to be lucky enough to, kill a deer or an antelope or whatever part of the world you were living in, an elk or whatever, you didn't say, "This is mine. Nobody else is going to get any of it." It was taken for granted. This is for the group. So they were relatively economically egalitarian, not out of ideology, but virtually out of necessity. The next form of human society is early horticultural societies. Now, these appeared only about 10 to 12,000 years ago. So hunting and gathering societies lasted a very long time. And what distinguishes early horticultural societies from later agricultural societies is that early horticultural societies were still pre-metal age. There was no metal being used for tools yet. Large animals still hadn't been domesticated. So the tools for these early horticultural societies were basically the digging stick and the equivalent of a hoe, but made out of wood or bone or whatever. And so early horticultural societies were basically like gardening societies, small plots of land being cultivated. And so you could now have relatively small settlements, more or less permanently located. But when I say small, a few hundred people perhaps. No longer having to be nomads because they could do cultivation. Again, one can ask, what would wealth have consisted of in societies like this? Perhaps marginal differences in housing, but not much more than that. Again, these were communal societies, meaning that it wasn't that each individual family had their own plot of land and one family might do a lot better than the rest. No, it was produced communally and consumed communally. Now, I'm not trying to idealize these societies or romanticize them. I'm simply laying the groundwork for the world of the Bible which is about to emerge. And this leads us then to the next form of human society, agricultural societies, and the emergence of a growing chasm between rich and poor. And this emerged because of two things acting together. One was the invention of metalworking. Happened in the 3000s BCE, began with copper, but quickly moved to bronze. And so for the first time, you now have metal plows. And you also have, during this time, the domestication of large farm animals, oxen, horses, donkeys, and so forth. And so suddenly, agriculture, as distinct from horticulture, becomes possible. And there's this enormous boom in agricultural production because of the metal plow and the use of large animals. And so for the first time, cities, meaning settled concentrations of wealth, become possible because of this surge in agricultural production. And once you have several thousands, we think the largest cities of the 3000s BCE were maybe 30,000 people or so. Once you have, let's say, 30,000 people living together in a city, you begin to have a need for some kind of government. Because, amongst other things, the city needs not only organization, but protection from those other nomads who are still living out there in the hills and who realize, my God, they got stores of food and other goodies in there. And so these cities typically become walled cities, and they also develop a military force. So suddenly you have government and an army. And this is the basis then for the emergence of a domination system. Over a period of time, the government and the army become the ruling elites of power and wealth. And increasingly, they set up the social system in such a way that it benefits financially, primarily them. And this then is the emergence of the ancient domination system, also sometimes called pre-industrial agrarian societies. Now, I know that sounds jargony, but it's helpful. Pre-industrial. There's no industry yet. Whatever manufacturing there is done by hand. Therefore, the primary source of wealth is still agriculture. And so pre-industrial agrarian societies names a bit more than the simple phrase, the ancient domination system. Let me move very quickly now through the four primary characteristics of these societies, again for the sake of illuminating the world of the Bible. By the way, it also illuminates much of human history. This is the world of the Middle Ages in Europe. This is basically the world of Europe really until the industrial and democratic revolutions of the 17th, 18th, and 19th century. So this form of human society lasted a very long time. Again, moving through the characteristic rapidly. They were politically oppressive, meaning very simply, ruled by a few. The aristocracy and the monarchy, the elites of power and wealth. Ordinary people had no say in how the society was structured. Secondly, they were economically exploitative. The elites of power and wealth, with their extended families comprising about 1% to 2% of the population, commonly acquired about 2/3 of the annual production of wealth in these societies. And of course, that wealth came mostly from the agricultural production of peasants. By the way, when you realize this, it explains so much. Most of you have traveled, at least in Europe, and you've seen the remains of the Middle Ages, sometimes ruins, but very often still intact. Castles, sometimes palaces from that time, these magnificent Gothic cathedrals. In Italy, you see this magnificent art from the Middle Ages and so forth. Well, where did the wealth come from to construct and produce all of that? It didn't come from industry. There was no industry yet. It basically came from the agricultural production of peasants. And how did the elites get their hands on roughly 2/3 of the annual agricultural production in these societies? Well, through direct ownership of land and employing peasants as sharecroppers, tenant farmers, day laborers, and so forth, or through taxation on agricultural production. It's not that the elites produced anything themselves, unless you think going to war is a product. So, economically exploitative. Thirdly, religiously legitimated. In most societies, the theology of the elite class sanctions the way society is. You know, it's said that the social order reflects the will of God. Kings rule by divine right. It wasn't our idea that the society be set up this way. God set it up this way. And fourth and finally, these societies were chronically violent. And I'm not talking about crime here or criminal violence, but organized violence, namely war, as well as the use of violence internally by the elites to control their own populations. Again, to use the language on the handout, with concentrations of population and wealth, armies and warfare emerged. Now, there had always been violence in human affairs, tribal raiding parties and so forth in the nomadic period, okay? But with the emergence of cities, you now have the possibility of standing armies, and in the ancient world, wars were most commonly initiated by elites, by the ruling class, for the sake of adding to their wealth by defeating other elites. I mean, imagine that you're part of the aristocracy and you've maxed out the wealth you can draw from your own peasant class. How do you increase your wealth if you want to do that? By acquiring the peasants that work for other elites and their land through military conquest. So common is this form of social organization, the ancient domination system. And I note in passing, it has modern and post-industrial forms too. So common is this that it might be called the normalcy of civilization. So it's not an unusual way of putting things together. This leads me to part 2 then. In this context, what is God's passion? And I love that question, by the way. It gets us away from thinking of the word passion in the Bible as referring primarily to the suffering of Jesus.